I want to start with seeing a show of hands of who is currently, and I think this may be most of you, working in or studying to work in an informal education environment. So, show of hands. And please keep your hands up if you have previous experience in the for-profit world. And of those people, keep your hands up if you find your nonprofit work more satisfying. And I'm not talking about salary. Okay. Well, I share this with most of you. I actually have a background in investment securities, which I consider the belly of the corporate beast. And it's much more satisfying to do the work I do now, and at risking being the master of the obvious, the difference between what we're doing in the for-profit world and what we're doing in our nonprofit informal education centers is rooted in the fact that the for-profit world serves the bottom line. That's not why we exist. Our institutions exist to have an impact in the world. And that impact is defined by our institutional mission. I was invited to speak about visitor services, evaluation, and satisfaction. I'm going to do that. But the only reason we do or think about or talk about visitor research or audience research is because of the fact that we're trying to have an impact in the world. We have an impact in the world which serves our educational mission through the experiences we design for our visitors. Now, what kind of impacts am I talking about? Influencing people to become visitors, impressing those visitors with whatever our messages are that are rooted in our missions, inspiring them to come back, and inspiring them to give us good word of mouth. So having said that, I want to let you know my goals this evening are to give you a brief introduction to the field of audience research, of visitor studies, which includes audience research, evaluation, and visitor satisfaction. And I'm going to highlight some trends. I actually hesitate to call them trends because these are some things that are coming on big and strong and are going to stay with us. I'm going to highlight recent work on visitor motivations. Why do visitors seek us out? I'm going to also highlight how our thinking about impacts has recently really been expanded by a couple key publications. And I'm also going to be talking about, briefly about a new interest in the field in serving audiences with special needs. So as I touched on, the types of visitor studies that exist are audience research, which seeks to describe our audience, who's coming to our, describing our audience, describing maybe the audience we want to have, understanding what motivates them, what they need. Evaluation, exhibit and program evaluation, informs the development of the specific experiences we're designing for our visitors. It can also assess how effective those experiences are. And lastly, visitor satisfaction looks at the entire visitor experience, not just what's happening in the gallery or at the program, but the entire experience from even before they arrive through our doors. Now I want to pause for a moment and revisit Falk and Deerking's model of the museum visit, and this is going to be familiar to most of you, but his model of the museum visit consists of three spheres that intersect. And those spheres are: one, the visitor, him or herself; two, the physical of the museum, what's actually here that we offer them; and then the third is the social scape. The social scape includes not only the people that the visitor brought with him or her, but the other visitors they encounter, as well as the staff and volunteers that they encounter. So I want to hold, and where those three intersect is the place of the visit. It's the museum visit that is right in that intersection. And I want to hold that in mind because when we come back to talk about visitor satisfaction, we're going to take a stroll through each of those bubbles. So to begin with, audience research, as I said, describes our audience, what motivates them, what do they want from us, what are they seeking out when they come to us. And in my opinion, no discussion about audience research is complete without touching on a paper by Zahava Deering, D-O-E-R-I-N-G. in the early 90s, she wrote a paper describing what she has, and let me tell you who she is. She's the lead social science researcher at Smithsonian Institute. She is also the chief editor of Curator. Now, she wrote this paper in the early 90s that describes institutional perceptions of visitors that she found in the field. And the three perspectives she describes are visitor as stranger, guest, and client. And I'm going to describe those for you, and it will sound like these could be an evolution in thought, and for some institutions it certainly is. But these attitudes can be found in many different institutions in different combinations depending on who you speak with. So visitor as stranger is in the situation where staff is focused on the collection and that visitor is a necessary nuisance. Now some of these might sound familiar to some of you. Visitor as guest is when we as the museum want to be a good host. We know what's good for our guest, so we're going to give them what's good for them and educate them. Visitor as client is when we take a look at the visitor and say, what does the visitor need? Certainly we have to serve our mission and deliver messages that fit our mission, but what does the visitor need in order to connect with that? So at your own institution, if you're not sure what institutional perception exists, it's not too hard to start to get a look into that. Talking to staff members and finding out how do they characterize the institutional mission and how do they characterize their role in that, and listen for where the visitor figures. How does the visitor figure in their discussion of that? And that will help shed some light on what your institutional perceptions are and where they stand. A really important aspect of audience research is in studying visitor motivations. Again, what do they want from us? And again, I'm going to start with Zahava Deering. Years ago, she did a study at 9 of the Smithsonian institutions, including the zoo, and her team was looking to find out what kind of experiences are these visitors seeking. And they identified 4 main types of experiences. The first one is social experiences, spending time with family and friends, seeing my children learn new things. So a zoo is a real typical place where people know they can go and do that. The second type of experience they found people looking for were object experiences, where people are moved by beauty or seeing rare things that are uncommon or valuable, what have you. The third was cognitive experiences, people looking to enrich their understanding, gain knowledge, or reflect on meaning. And the fourth was introspective experiences, and this is almost like making a spiritual connection, imagining a different place or time, being reminded of childhood, that sort of thing, even feeling a sense of belonging. Now, Zahava and her team in that research also drew 2 conclusions, which were somewhat groundbreaking at the time, but now, you know how when you have an epiphany about something and it's so brilliant and shining, and then you say it out loud and it's so obvious? Like, why do I even need to say it out loud? This is how these strike me when I look at them now, but in their historical context, they're really quite powerful. So she and her team concluded these 2 things. 1, visitors make use of museums for their own purposes and from varying perspectives. I think we could all agree on that at this point. That's a given. And 2, the museum can influence these outcomes, but cannot control them, much as we might like to. There's another researcher who's been looking at visitor motivations, and that's Jan Packer, who's at Queensland University in Australia. And she's been focusing on mental restoration. And she feels that there's a real strong call for this in a significant number of visitors, according to her research. Now, she describes 5 elements of the restorative activity or environment. And those of you that are familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory are going to find some of this really resonating. So the first of these 5 restorative elements includes fascination, being engaged without effort. The second is being away, being physically and or mentally removed from your everyday existence and environment. The third is extent, that the environment has sufficient content and structure to occupy the mind for an extended period. Fourth is compatibility, which is providing a good fit with one's own purpose or inclinations, or I would say personal narrative. We're going to visit that again in a little bit. And then the fifth element is it's the relaxed and unhurried nature of the visit itself. Now, the most recent work on visitor motivations is taking the field by storm. And I'll be honest with you and tell you I'm still digesting this. This came out last year, and I finally got my hands on it recently. This is by John Falk, who I already mentioned. John Falk and Lynn Deering are the ones that created this model of the museum visit with the 3 spheres. For those of you who don't know, John Falk was the founder of ILI, the Institute for Learning Innovation in Annapolis, and he's now currently professor of a department of informal education at the university in Oregon. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering which one off the top of my head. Now, in his new book, Identity in the Museum Visitor Experience, he's identified 5 identities that are the source of motivation for museum visits. And this is the result of thousands of interviews with visitors at many, many different kinds of institutions across the country and in other countries. These 5 identities are: 1, the explorer, someone who's constantly motivated to go out and learn and do and explore. The second is the facilitator. The facilitator is there for somebody else's benefit. So really typically a mother, but also, and this will ring familiar for a lot of you, the host, the local host of visitors from out of town, who's shuffling their visiting relatives or whoever to institutions for a visit. The third is experience seeker. Well, of course I went to the bishop. That's what you do when you're in Honolulu, and I got my picture taken there. The professional hobbyist is the fourth one, and that's the person who's really looking for deep, deep connection. It's the curator's dream visitor, right, that's going to read all those big labels. And the fifth is he calls the recharger. Now, those of you that are familiar with John's earlier work will recognize the term spiritual pilgrim. His colleagues finally talked him out of that term, and he's using recharger. And you see a lot of these are reflected in Jan Packer's work as well. His work has a lot of implications for marketing as well as for knowing what types of experiences we should be designing. Now, in your situation at your institution, if you're not sure why people are seeking you out, it's really not too hard to find out. Speaking with visitors in a systematic way as they're arriving to the institution with a couple simple questions. Why did you decide to come to the museum today? Or the zoo or the garden, what have you? And what do you expect to do? What did you plan to do when you got here today? So, well, I just wanted an outing with my visitor or whatever. It's pretty transparent, and you can pretty easily get an idea of how people perceive you. How do you fit into their worldview? What are you good for them? What do they want from you? So, I'm going to move now to exhibit and program evaluation. Whereas audience research is looking broadly at our audience and what they need, exhibit and program evaluation is very targeted. It's project specific. Because it is project specific, a lot of it doesn't get published. There are places where you can find evaluation reports, including informalscience.org, and a lot of evaluators are posting reports there, and they're not all science related, so it's worth a look if you're curious to see examples of reports. So exhibit and program evaluation serves to inform our process as we develop these experiences for our visitors, whether they're programmatic or exhibit. And it also can serve to inform us about how effective those experiences are at communicating our desired messages or impacts on the visitor. When I talk about impacts, we typically, in the past, have always thought about them as being cognitive, affective, and behavioral. And as I mentioned earlier, I am going to be speaking about how our thinking about impacts has been broadened by a couple key publications, and we will get to that. Now, the evaluation process should be iterative. it's very often just a one-shot and then the project moves on. In a perfect world, we get to revisit the floor time and again with our evaluation research questions while we're in the process of developing something. And even given that, we often think of evaluation as having 3 phases. Now in real life, these phases blend quite a bit, but it's useful to understand these 3 phases and what the intent of each of them is. So the first one is called front-end evaluation. Front-end evaluation is done very, very early in the process. The goal of front-end evaluation is to find out how visitors perceive of your proposed exhibit topic. It's what we call their personal narrative. What do they know about this? What are their opinions and experiences around this topic? What maybe do they think they know that's inaccurate? What kind of vocabulary are they using when they talk about it? Where do they get their information? Years ago, I was doing a study for an exhibit that never did manifest about Mars, and I never had heard of the movie. There's a movie, Red Planet, and I didn't know it was out there. And so where are people telling me that they get their information about Mars? So many people told me it was from that movie. So I'm continually reminded about how atypical I and my museum colleagues are. It's dangerous to think that we can speak for the public because we are really on the inside and we don't think about these things the way the public does. The second phase of exhibit program evaluation is called formative evaluation. So this is when you're on the road of actually having elements that you're developing, you're scripting, and we typically think of formative evaluation as testing exhibit mock-ups with visitors, but you can also test panel text. It doesn't have to be a physical element. If you're working with interactives, it's really important to prototype if you can, because there are so many things that you would never anticipate of people. Like, obviously the crank goes this way. Well, that's not obvious to people. Or we had we tested an interactive for a global climate change exhibit, and it was it's a board with a little graphic of a mountain. And behind it, there's with a lever, you can change the scene behind these little slots that are cut in the mountain. And as the temperature goes up, you're pushing this bar up, and it's symbolic of the temperature rising with global climate change. And the environments the cool environment goes higher and higher on the mountain, and there are little animals that live in certain environments. So you put the animals in the slots, but then you change the temperature. And so the animals have to go to the higher slot, and the higher slot, well, there's less and less space. Well, in truth, those animals aren't going to survive. We tested this exhibit with children, and they figured the animals went to the other side of the mountain. Now, none of us had known to anticipate that, but we're not concrete thinkers like the children are, so you can't over-test if you have the opportunity to do it. The third phase is summative evaluation, and that's when we come in after the fact and assess how effective the exhibit or the program is with visitors. Are they leaving with the impacts we had intended? And if we have budget left over to remediate, then it's a remedial study. This is the exception to the rule. Most institutions have a very difficult time earmarking money to keep for remediation. There's a lot of this kind of work that you can do in-house, and that's what we've been dunking our heads in this week in our workshop. Something is better than nothing as long as that something has been done well, consistently and intellectually honestly. There are many, many resources out there to help you get started if there's an evaluation study you need to do. And I'd be happy to, I have a resource list I'd be happy to share with you. I can get it to Stacy and he can distribute it. Keep it simple, clear, short, doable. We've been working really hard this week to ratchet down the kind of surveys that Bishop staff can do so that it isn't so daunting and that they're actually going to be able to hit the floor and collect some data. I'm not sure if we're there yet. We'll be hitting the floor tomorrow with real visitors instead of each other for practice, so we'll see how that goes. Now, I promised I would talk to you more about impacts. and the kind of impacts we can have. It's very important to understand the difference between the kind of impacts we as informal education centers can have in contrast with what formal education can do. We're very good at inspiring and exciting people, but research shows we're not so good at giving them new information or changing their perspective. One of the main reasons for that is something that Zaha Deering has pointed out. People seek things out that fit their worldview. And in a free choice learning environment, which is where we operate, people have free choice to gravitate towards things that confirm their point of view. So we, from the get-go, changing somebody's mind, not going to be one of our strong points. Now, in past years at conferences, I frequently get to the Visitor Studies Association conference. There's been a lot of consternation among some of the movers and shakers in the field. We can't let ourselves be held accountable to the same kind of impacts and evaluation that the formal education world goes under. And the reason I think that this was surfacing in the past several years is that as the economy squinches down and as NSF funding or IMLS funding or NEH funding might be threatened, we more and more have to prove our worth, prove that we're having impacts that are desirable and helpful to our nation and populace. So what has come out of that consternation has been really helpful and has had a lot of effect on how we think about impacts. Sue Allen, who was at the Exploratorium for a long time and by invitation went to NSF, where she's now a program officer, had a lot to do with authoring the NSF ISE Evaluation Framework. That's the National Science Foundation Informal Science Education Evaluation Framework. Now I know a lot of you are not in science, but hang in there with me because this stuff is really applicable and very useful in any content field. This is not a publication that's been printed. You can only find it online. And I'll get it to, it's a lot of gobbledygook, so I'll get it to Stacy and he can distribute that to you. What they did in this evaluation framework was struggle to find a way to standardize findings from summative studies of informal education programs. And part of that effort was to identify categories of impacts. So they have expanded our thinking from the 3 types of impacts I listed before to 5, which include those 3, and I'll read them to you. The first one listed is awareness, knowledge, or understanding. So there's your cognitive hit. The second is engagement or interest. How easy is it to witness engagement in your galleries? This is a really nice thing for us. The third is attitude. So there's your affective impact. The fourth is behavior, also one of our original 3. Now the 5th one is skills. So practicing skills is something that's more typically going to be found in a program situation instead of an exhibit situation, unless of course you're the unless you're the Exploratorium, who does nothing simply. And they actually have exhibits where they expect people to practice noticing the world around them. And most people don't get that complicated and would leave skill practice to a program context. So we thank NSF for helping us standardize this. NSF has also commissioned the National Resource Council to study if and how people learn science in an informal environment. Again, hang in there with me, people who are not in science, because this is really applicable to as well. You'll be happy to know they confirm that yes, people are learning in informal environments. And a part of their work came out with what they call 6 strands of science learning. I'm not going to read all 6 of them to you. They do tend to be rooted in formal ed, but adjusted slightly. And the 1st and 6th strand of science learning pertain closely to our informal education world. So when I say the word science, you can substitute for art or history or whatever you need. So the first one is learners in informal environments experience excitement, interest, and motivation to learn about phenomena in the natural and physical world. Excitement is now a form of learning. Be excited about that. It's great. Yay. Thank you. The sixth one, which also pertains really closely to our informal education world, is learners in informal environments think about themselves as science learners and develop an identity as someone who knows about, uses, and sometimes contributes to science. I think that translates very well to history and art really easily. So we thank them for expanding and acknowledging the kind of valuable impacts that we can have in the informal education world. Now, if I had given this talk 10 years ago, we all would have been younger and most of us would have been thinner, and I probably wouldn't have talked about visitor satisfaction. It's somewhat new in people's consciousness, and it's coming on big and strong and important because of this threat to our very existence and our funding, because of not just the squinching economy, but the plethora of other choices that people have to do with their edutainment dollar or time, whether it's educational or not. So when I say satisfaction, I'm talking about, and I just pulled this from the dictionary, the contentment one feels when one has fulfilled a desire, need, or expectation. It's rooted in expectation. And as we've learned from John Falk, expectations are dictated by our motivations. All of this stuff is woven together really well. Now, to me, the most exciting thing, one of the very many exciting things about studying visitor satisfaction is that it's everybody's responsibility. Visitor satisfaction looks at the entire visit, not just the exhibit or the program. It's the website, it's the cafe, it's the bathroom, it's the parking lot, it's the signage. It's everybody's responsibility. Whereas evaluation tends to be only under the aegis of education or exhibits, visitor satisfaction becomes everybody's concern. A satisfied visitor is a visitor that will take in our messages better, will hopefully visit again, and will give us good word of mouth. And good word of mouth, we used to have statistics that, for every bad experience, they go out there and they tell 10 people. Well, not anymore. With Yelp and social networking. So that it has a huge impact. So when we think about the visitor experience and visitor satisfaction, we have to recognize that their experience and their satisfaction are influenced from things both within themselves and outside of themselves. And that brings us right back to to Falk and Deer King's model with the 3 spheres. And so now I want to walk through each of those spheres and take a look at where can we have an influence. Remember, we can influence the visitor experience, but we cannot control it. So let's start with the bubble that is the visitor. We already know that audience research helps us understand the motivations of that visitor, and that research can tell us how to shape our marketing, how to shape our experience, the experiences that we're presenting. We can also shape people's expectations with our marketing efforts. We know that front-end evaluation can help us understand the visitor and produce things that the visitor is going to be able to connect with and understand. And we know that formative evaluation is going to help us create things that the visitor is going to actually be able to use. So moving to the physical bubble, again, front-end and formative evaluation help us develop those physical exhibits in a way that's going to be effective for the visitor. But we need to look at the whole museum visit, not just what's happening in the gallery. And there's a very useful tool for doing that in the book called Experienceology by Stephanie Weaver. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'll tell you that Stephanie and I are friends and we're on a team right now. Hers is one of the books I frequently pull off the shelf. She has dissected the museum exhibit into 8 phases. She has a terrific website where she has described these as well. Experience, normal spelling, ology at the end. So I'm going to walk through these 8 aspects of the entire visit and think about how you might be able to have influence on these things for the sake of the visitor. So the first thing she describes is the invitation. Is your website easy to find and navigate? Is your marketing effective? Is it going through the right channels? The second one would be the welcoming. When somebody finally arrives, were you easy to find? Where do I park? Can I see from my car where I'm supposed to go? When I get in, am I greeted warmly? Is it awkward to get through ticketing, or is the front desk full of little notes and stuff, and it's too confusing and I don't feel like it's clear and nicely welcoming me? The third is orientation. Can I find my way around? Once I get there, what are my options? What do you have to offer me? Where do I begin? Comfort. Comfort is huge, and there's an ocean of literature out there. When we think about comfort, this is where issues of universal design also come in. So are there enough benches? Is there enough light? Are things easy to get around and that sort of thing? The fifth one she identifies is communication. Are all our efforts consistent and clear? The sixth is sensation. Are we engaging all the senses? The seventh is common sense. Are we paying attention to what's going on? Are we watching visitors in the walkway? Even if we're not doing an official study, do we occasionally watch that orientation and people coming into the entrance and see what's going on? And then the eighth is the finale. How is it that we're greeting them when they leave? Is it pleasant and warm? Do we honestly welcome them back again? That sort of thing. So in bringing this home to think about that physical bubble, Experienceology does have a very helpful self-study guide in there for it. Now the last bubble is the social bubble. The social scape includes the visitor, him or herself, as well as the other visitors that they find there. And we've talked about how to influence them when we address the visitor bubble. But what we haven't talked about is the other part of the social scape, and that's the staff and volunteers. I really hope this is a place where you can have influence on the visitor experience through what's going on with the staff. There's a lot of literature about customer service. Not as much of it is coming out of the museum field yet. We learn a lot from retail and hospitality about customer service through our staff. And there's a fun, easy read called Why We Buy by Paki Underhill. And you have to kind of wade through the very beginning because he pats himself on the back a whole lot for establishing the science of studying shopping. But it's worth it because there are so many nice little tips in there. And he talks a lot about comfort and also the customer service aspect. Now, the last area I want to touch on is something that I think is the newest of these issues that I've been presenting. And that is serving audiences with special needs. There are a couple leaders I'm aware of in the U.S. that are working on this a lot. Paul Gabriel is an educational consultant in San Francisco, and he's been merging into the museum world for years now. And those of you that have ever been at WMA might have seen him present. He's a great speaker. The other person who's authoring and busy in this field is Christine Riesch, who's in charge of evaluation at Museum of Science Boston. They contend, and rightly so, let me back up, the kind of special needs we're talking about are typically, the typical work that Paul does is with people, youth primarily, that have ADHD, learning differences, ASD to some extent, autism spectrum disorder to some extent as well. And what he concludes and sees over and over again is that if we can serve those audiences well, then we're serving everybody better. Because those audiences tire really quickly. They can't fight with a label to figure out what it's trying to say. And all of us could use that kind of help. Let's make it easy for people to get our message, and let's not make them work. So if we can produce something that's accessible to the special needs population, everybody is going to benefit from that. I am really excited about this. A few weeks ago, I did a focus group with parents of children that have special needs. And it was very inspiring. And they were speaking about their children that had, we didn't have any of the special learners like the ADHD type of students, but we had lots of autism in those families, cerebral palsy, ataxic cerebral palsy, albinism, different kinds of visual impairment. And it was so fascinating to hear these parents talk for many reasons, but especially to hear them talk about what are the barriers, what makes it hard for them to make a visit at any kind of informal education institution. Can anyone take a guess at, for every single one of these families, the single biggest barrier when they try to go to a museum or zoo or something? Any guesses? Attention span? Stairs? Staff? You're getting close. Has nothing to do with the venue. It's the people they find there. And sometimes it's staff, and sometimes it's visitors, and sometimes it's both. And what was one of the very many inspiring things about talking to these folks was, at every juncture, when we thought of some kind of support for them, they were like, oh, and that would help parents of typical kids know better too. And let me comment on the language. We discuss their children as being neurologically atypical as opposed to children that are neurologically typical. And this is very common parlance in that community. So every time, like, oh yeah, you know, it would be great to have a map of the exhibit with these little icons because a lot of these kids need to plan in advance what they're going to do. They can't just go into a new space. So we were imagining different kinds of maps and activities we could create. And what was it that jumped out for these parents? You know, if there was something you could click on the website, then other parents would see that that exists and they would have to admit that we exist. It was very moving. And I think we're going to see a lot more coming out of that field. And it will be a good thing for all of us when we do. So in closing, I'd like to read to you from the Gospel according to John Fall. He puts this so nicely. I'm going to borrow his words. Excuse me, like I said, I've been talking for 2 days. Although it was not always true, today most museums exist in order to attract and serve visitors, as many as possible. Although museums have long wondered about who visits their institutions, why, and to what end, today they feel economically, socially, and politically compelled to do so. Today's museum has no choice but to think seriously about who their visitors are and why they come, as well as about who does not visit and why not. There's the Holy Grail for you. Visitors are at the heart of the 21st century museum's existence. Understanding something about museum visitors is not a nicety, it is a necessity. Asking who visits the museum, why, and to what end are no longer mere academic questions. These are questions of great importance, and I think these are questions that are going to inform our continued existence as informal education centers. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed sharing all this with you.